Hi, and welcome to another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am Sarah, and I'm joined by my awesome co host, JM. Hi, JM, how are you?
Oh, I'm good, thanks.
And we are joined by the lovely author, Diana Johnstone. Diana Johnstone is an author of one of my absolute favorite books, and definitely my favorite book about Yugoslavia, Fools Crusade, Yugoslavia, NATO and Western Delusions. And she's also an essayist and journalist that writes for Consortium News as well as other publications. Hi, Diana. How are you today? Welcome.
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about drawing parallels between Yugoslavia and current events today. I really highly recommend her book. I've posted about it numerous times on all of our platforms. So get it, and if you want, you can read it along with this episode. It'll really help you kind of understand what we're talking about. So the first thing that I'd like to touch on is the misuse of the word genocide. I'm starting off with the heavy topics first, I guess. But so we've seen throughout, it happened during Yugoslavia. You talk about it in your book. I believe the quote is, "The illusion of knowing creates an illusion of responsibility, and once the accusation of genocide is widely accepted, it becomes a matter of honor not to listen to the other side." So um how do we recover this word? So we know that this past spring the United Nations, they found no evidence of genocide in Ukraine. I mean, they made sure to add the word "yet" just in case it ever happens in the future, but their quote was, we have not found that there has been a genocide within Ukraine." So we still see on social media and even in some mainstream media the use of the word. How do we recover this word so it retains its meaning?
Well, personally, I would rather not retain this word because I think this word uh, has become, above all, an instrument of justifying conflicts. Uh, rather than a description of anything, it's become the excuse for intervening in foreign wars that began in Yugoslavia, like so much, because I want to point out Yugoslavia was sort of an experimental laboratory for breaking up Russia. And one of the aspects of the Yugoslav war, which was an explosion of dishonest reporting about things, is this use of the word genocide. And of course, it was used then. We must bomb Serbia in order to prevent a genocide. There was no genocide to be prevented. And then that was used again in Libya to destroy Libya because we had to prevent a genocide. So actually, the use of genocide is become particularly involved in imaginary genocides that the United States military must prevent by ruining a country. And frankly, at this point, I don't see much use in that term. I mean, killing people is killing people. There's massacres and so on. They've been going on all through history. The word genocide is fairly recent. History went along without it for thousands of years, and I think we could still go without it because I see that word as more utilitarian in a negative way than positive.
And even along these lines of the misuse of terms and kind of like their utilization for propaganda, we have a new Hitler on our hands, like we tend to do. So Milosevic was the Hitler of the 90s, and then I think Saddam Hussein was another Hitler that we had. I think Gaddafi might have been Hitler, and now we have Putin. And kind of all of this sort of, you call it black propaganda, which is the correct term for the word, but now we tend to use the term false flags. So and then during Yugoslavia, there was each of these false flags, if you will, each attack would be kind of in synchronous with some major event. that was going on, or at a critical moment, at a critical turning point. And we've also kind of seen that in Ukraine. So most recently, JM might have to help me out, but remembering the strike on Kramatorsk, the train station, and then more recently was the strike in Donetsk, which was firstly blamed very heavily on Russia, and then later on found out that it was actually a Ukrainian missile, and then kind of trying to drag Poland into the war by claiming that piece of artillery was Russian. Um, and then Bucha, which still kind of troubles me to this day. I know you talked about it in one podcast that I listened to, which was excellent. It was on the podcast. I think it's called Pay Attention. But you guys touched on Bucha a little bit. But do you see any? This might be a little hot button issue, but do you see any parallels between Srebrenica and Bucha, or anything else that has occurred in Ukraine?
Well, I don't. I'm not so sure that I see. What I see is that you have Western media that will, whatever happens, when every time there's a massacre of any sort, there's a bomb and people are killed, the Ukrainian will come out and say that Putin did this because he loves to kill people. He's a monster. He does it for the fun of killing. And the Western media will take it up and believe it. And so that's the parallel. The parallel is in Yugoslavia, the Western media was ready to believe that when there was a bomb in a marketplace and the anti-Serbs said that the Serbs did it, well, the media was there to say, oh, it's terrible, the Serbs did this, of course. I mean, you have the combination of a media which is totally obedient to the war aims of NATO, and then the whoever our allies are will just accuse the other side of genocide and everything, and the media will pick it up. And this, I don't need to call it false flag or anything. It's just the regular practice of the obedient Western media, and whatever country whatever our client state is saying. And of course, the Hitler business is just, unfortunately, there's a fascination for the last 75 years with the period of 1933 to 1945, when you had Hitler. And I think I'm afraid that very many people in the West, and especially the United States, the only thing they know about world history, or think they know about it, is the Hitler period. And so whenever there's a bad guy, it's Hitler again, because that's the only one they know about. And they're not going to say it's Caligula. They're going to say it's Hitler. And
I don't know that anybody would get that reference these days. They would say,
well, no, I mean, frankly, there is an abysmal ignorance of history that is at loose right now in the world. And that makes it possible to just recount everything by analogy with the Hitler period, and where there's, there's this horrible monster, and then he wants to kill people and blah, blah, blah. And actually that history is not recounted accurately. But it's the analogy for everything that happens. And so we're doing it all over again. And this degree of ignorance makes it possible to live in a world of lies.
Yeah, I think that is a good segue into another issue that we were both taken in by when reading your book, which is this idea of a Germany resurgent, reasserting itself as a great power through different means, and saying that in doing so it must do so through atoning through its past. But you suggest that actually it isn't really that simple, and actually there's a bit more of a darker substrate beneath the beautiful words. Could you describe for our listeners kind of that idea, that conceit that you identified?
Well, I think the Germans now are quite divided. but you can't know it because the media is not divided. The media and the government are in harmony completely in this Ukrainian business. But what I noticed, you see, I spent a lot of time in Germany, and I was especially in Germany in the 1980s when there was a big popular movement against the stationing of nuclear missiles in Germany, and it was sort of a peace movement, and it saw the beginning of the Green Party, and it was very strong, and it led up to reunification. Now, I was around Germans a lot also because I spent a time as a press officer in the European Parliament, and I was observing these things very closely. And I was rather astonished, you see, in about in the late 1990s, that these Germans, particularly the Social Democrats, the left-wing people who had been so much for peace and so much against, we must get rid of the enemy images, the enemy stereotypes of our opponents in the past wars, and they were all for seeing people as friends and so on. And I was quite astonished to see how this suddenly evaporated when Serbia was the enemy. Well, now you see, Serbia is considered the enemy from World War One, and all of a sudden, when Serbia started being labeled as the new Hitler, the new horrible, whatever it was, I was surprised that these lately peaceful Germans were suddenly adopting the old stereotype against the Serbs. And of course, now with the Russians, it's the same thing, but much, much, much worse. And somehow it's persuaded me that aside from all of the various economic and this kind of geostrategic interests one can talk about, that there is something psychological that has affected quite a few Germans, that they have been blamed for decades for being so evil, that to find themselves now on the good side with the Americans against the Russians gives them a kind of satisfaction, a kind of nasty satisfaction, I must say. And Germans are historically a rather moralistic people. You see that from the Reformation and so on. I mean, even if when they're Nazis, they're being moralistic. They thought they were, being good, doing the right thing. And I would compare that. I find that Italians and especially French are more rational in their politics, but there is this satisfaction of being on the good side with the power of the Americans, and this of redoing the end of World War II, which actually there were some people in the West who wanted to do it at the time, but they didn't. I mean, to switch sides and go against the Soviet Union. And this is a psychological factor that can help explain why the German policy is actually very damaging to German interests. It's devastating to their economy, and yet a lot of people are going along with it for the moral satisfaction it gives them. But of course, on the other hand, there are a lot of people who don't like it at all, but they are being pretty much silenced at the moment.
I think another good thing that you bring up is this idea of self-determination among peoples, which just sounds all very lovely. United Nations Charter, the 14 points, Wilsonian principles. Aren't the Germans embracing our way of doing things and our way of thinking things, showing that they've moved on beyond their past? But you suggest in your book that actually this is quite a traditional German great power politics weapon in Eastern Europe.
Well, yes. I mean, it was something that they developed because they had they were exploiting minorities in order to dominate the regions, because they were the most powerful power there. And so, of course, when you say, you're always talking about values and so on. Well, territorial integrity is a value which is opposite of self-determination, and you get a clash between those values. And of course, which side you take and which value you promote will depend on what your interests are in that particular case. That's the way it works. And you see that powers are for territorial integrity when they're in favor of that country, and therefore self determination when they want to tear it apart. And unfortunately, you have to be very specific about these things. And of course, you can't just go all out for one of these things, ignoring the other.
You've also touched on the idea repeatedly in your writings about this idea of NATO expansion and safety, but you've also, I think, questioned quite articulately if it really does make people safer, and also some of the motives for NATO expansion. Could you expound upon those for our listeners?
Oh yes, well, the fact is that many of these countries where we've expanded, the population was not in favor of it. And not so long ago, the Ukrainians were majority not in favor of it. And we say, oh, they have the right to join NATO. Well, you're talking about the leaders of the country have the right to the privileges that they hope to get from joining NATO. But many of these Eastern European countries, I think, in polls, they did not really want to join NATO. They wanted to join the EU because they thought that would give them a lot of wealth and prosperity. And it was sort of joining NATO was a ticket to the EU. And it was so partly on that way, as if you're in NATO, you'll get in the EU. And a lot of people in the East wanted to be in the EU for economic hope, because the EU gives a lot of money to these new members. But NATO, on the other hand, is only going to make them poorer, because joining NATO means you've got to buy a lot of US weapons, or they keep nagging you to do that. And you get your defense budget becomes a defense of NATO. You have to buy the weapons that the US is selling you, which may be used in Afghanistan or someplace, but not for your own national defense, because then you become part of the NATO international war machine, which is what it's been ever since the Kosovo War. It's been an international machine for going into other countries, not for defending its members, but for aggression against other countries. And that's what it really means. And of course, the leaders of countries can hope that they get in, and because they'll get benefits from being part of the club, but it has really very little to do with self-defense. I mean, it has nothing to do, in fact, with self-defense, because then they become, in fact, their defense depends on the United States, because it's the United States that finally decides everything. And the only benefit is a psychological benefit. Oh, we belong to the West, which is sort of a mystique, but there's no practical advantage whatsoever.
This is something that I've also been thinking about lately with this idea of NATO, because sometimes, like, NATO not only instigates wars, but they also, like you kind of touched on, they use wars to create a precedent for more expansion like they did with Yugoslavia. I mean, the board balkanization exists for a reason. And immediately following, I think it was 1999 is when they created all the maps for all the prior Yugoslavian states and even up into the Baltics. And then this time, this conflict, we're already seeing them definitely shy away from even toying with the idea of Ukrainian NATO membership. But they, like you said, they disarmed like half of Europe, and then we're trying to push for Finland, Sweden NATO membership so they could be dependent on the United States. And then Finland immediately started building a wall. So it's like, does so the entrance into NATO actually made you less safe. Like it made your border, what you perceive as your border with Russia, less safe. It's just a really weird. It's a really weird like chain of thought. If it like, if you do you know what I'm talking about? Like we're sending our weapons. We're totally behind the EU when it comes to Ukraine, even though the EU is not necessarily a military bloc. And then they're like, well, now you don't have any weapons, so you're going to have to join NATO. Like it's kind of like this like bait and switch sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's actually it's very simply, NATO is simply the way that the United States exercises total military control, and with it, foreign policy control over European nations. It's as simple as that. It's the United States. The United States conquered Europe, thanks to the Soviet Union, if I may say so, because it was the Soviet Union that militarily defeated Nazi Germany. But the United States came in late, in the right place, and managed to occupy a big piece, which it's kept ever since. The Soviet Union gave up its occupied countries. The United States still occupies them. Germany has been an occupied nation, militarily occupied, and I would say politically occupied ever since 1945. Italy is occupied militarily. Belgium is occupied. The Netherlands is occupied. And so, but the NATO membership is also a way to keep American control of, I say, not only their military, but their foreign policy as well. And it's simply an expansion of the United States empire. I'm sorry, but that's what it is. It's quite obvious.
In your book, this kind of leads into this idea of EU nationalism as well. And in the Fools Crusade, you talk about this new sort of nationalism, which is the exaltation of EU membership over national sovereignty, expressed in terms of self-glorification as anti-nationalists devoted to human rights and suitable to join the big club we always talk about. We're seeing some nations really try to assert themselves through political maneuvering, especially states like Hungary, who has consistently been the target of Western media, Poland most recently in their election cycle, and Slovakia, surprisingly, that election did not go the way the West wanted it to go. Do you think that Ukraine and even Georgia, so what I'm trying to say is those aforementioned states are now asserting their national identities very, very strongly, separate from the EU, while other countries, maybe like Italy, have to kind of deny their own nationalism to succumb to the EU, while these other three are doing the opposite. Do you think that Ukraine and maybe even Georgia have already or will succumb to this EU nationalism? Because we know that nationalism in Ukraine is very strong. It's a topic of contention, especially in this conflict. But the argument is that you kind of need to forego that state-specific nationalism to embrace this kind of EU nationalism. And sort of like these nationalistic movements, I see them as a natural reaction to an economic downturn. And now that Germany, so this is kind of, I guess this is kind of a two-parter question. So now that Germany and France have been knocked down quite a few pegs, who will be left to uphold the EU nationalism?
Well, that's a pretty complicated subject. And you see, I don't really, I think this EU nationalism is totally artificial. Um, it's an idea. I mean, I'm living in France, and of course, my point of view is very much influenced by being in France, and I've spent a lot of time in Germany and Italy as well. But you see the beginning of EU of Europe of the European idea was peace, and that is pretty much. I mean, they still will make peace between Germany and France with Europe, and then it will be peaceful and prosperous. Well, this peaceful business just means between Germany and France, but then they go make war against Yugoslavia, then they go make war against other countries. So that's where European nationalism comes in, because it becomes nationalist in the worst way, that is to say, in an aggressive war way, but there is no sense of solidarity between Europeans, and there's less and less, because I mean, I think since the European Union, there is less awareness of what's happening in neighboring countries than there used to be, because the EU is really an economic mechanism to prevent social policies. It was sold to people as making peace in Europe. It's not doing that. It's doing the opposite. And the reality of it's become the policies that are now being foisted on member states are neoliberal policies that are reducing their social measures. This is clear in France. I mean, very much so. The laws that are decided in Brussels and foisted on the member states are weakening the strong social state in France. The health system is suffering. The education system is suffering. Everything is suffering, and because it started with the Maastricht Treaty, which in fact made economic policy part of the system. I mean, we have a constitution in the United States. You can say what you want about it, we'll go to bed, but it doesn't spell out an economic system. What amounts to the Constitution here and the rules here they not only rule out socialism, they rule out Keynesianism. The great principle is competition, and competition means, for instance, in France has always been a country where the government kind of led the economy and did very well with government leadership. But now, under the competition myth, religion, I would say, the government can't help its industry because it would be against competition. So that the Americans, for instance, can come in and buy out the most critical industry in France, and then dismantle it, perhaps, or take it home or something. And the French can't do anything about it because this is competition. And it's not just competition between members that is sacred, but competition with the whole world. And so there is no real national interest that is allowed to survive. And this is justified ideologically by the notion that if you're concerned about your own country, my God, you're a nationalist. And if you're a nationalist, that means you want to be horrible to everybody else, which is an assumption that has not been proven. And so you have the ideology that if you are for the whole world, you're generous and kind and lovable. Whereas if you're concerned about the welfare of your own people, there's something bad about you. And that ideology has really been established in Europe so that people don't dare criticize Europe because they think it's inherently good and nationalism is inherently bad without examining the details.
Now, why do you think the French political elite surrendered that a lot of that sense of national sovereignty and state interventionism, so that sort of post-war Gaullism that they were so proud of? Why did they tie their hands so willingly? And well, why does someone like Emmanuel Macron see it as his mission to enforce a major pension reform even by decree rather than by consensus?
Well, Macron, in that particular case, it's because it was Europe that called for that. He's just carrying out the orders of Europe. It's as simple as that. The whole population is against it, and they're against it for a good reason. The fact is that you have to be pragmatic about these things. The fact is that especially with deindustrialization and the rise of artificial intelligence, there are fewer and fewer jobs for people in their late years. And the fact is that employers don't want to employ people who are 60 and above. And so what you get if you raise the retirement age is you get a lot of unemployed people over 60. And they don't get retirement pensions yet, and they're in trouble, you see. And so there are very solid reasons for people in this conjuncture to be against this reform. But it was laid down by Brussels, and so Macron he was chosen basically by the financial sector, which runs things now. And because all of these policies actually lead to breakdown of the social state and the rise of privatization of everything, and that's what's behind it. Now, there was a beginning. I was answering Macron, but it was the beginning of your question, which I've forgotten.
Oh yeah, why did the French political class just turn over all these instruments of power? Why
Ah,
did they surrender Gaullism for whatever this is?
well, yeah, this really the real surrender came under Mitterrand, and it was a matter of giving in to Europe because Mitterrand was elected in '81, as I recall, on this joint leftist program with the Communist Party. For Mitterrand was elected to have a policy of really similar to what de Gaulle had, strong state intervention and so on. And the word came down that Europe didn't like this, and they surrendered. That's when they surrendered to Europe, and that's when the left changed its tune. And that's exactly when by abandoning the common program, the socialists, well, the left then turned away from economic policies, and its theme became anti-racism, and in fact, it turned to identity politics, and then it went around to find bad guys who were racist and to fight against racism, and but why they gave up to Europe is partly, the propaganda for Europe was enormous. And I think the funniest part of the propaganda for Europe was popular precisely in France more than anywhere else. It was, oh, if we're in Europe, we'll be strong and we can be independent of the United States. That's the joke of all time, because in fact, becoming part of the European Union has made Europe totally dependent on the United States. It's had exactly that effect, but they didn't seem to know it, or if they knew it, they didn't say it. And you see, De Gaulle, De Gaulle had a vision of France, which was sort of historic, and probably again, another paradox is probably the people that most shared his view of France were the communists. But he was anti-communist, of course, so they were political opponents. But the fall of de Gaulle was also the fall of the communists, because they were the real people who cared about the welfare of the nation, and other people just like this idea of being this. Will be this big power because we're too small now to really matter anymore. So and the French thought at first that they were going to be the leading power, because Germany was being rather timid and shy in its foreign policy at the time the European unity began. And so France was the leading political power. And I think they would imagine that the EU is going to be sort of a huge France. Well, it isn't. And of course, now Germany is much more powerful. And besides that, there are all of these Eastern countries that have nothing to do with French interests whatsoever. And so France is just a little piece of this, but they went in thinking that they'd be more powerful because they would be sort of the leading power in this great power, just like the United States, and that would make them more free of the United States. Well, it's just the opposite that has happened.
I do want to touch on, since we're still on for kind of France and Germany and this Middle Europa area. Your recent article on Consortium News, Germans Down and Russians Out, which is one of my favorite quotes to invoke, especially right now. And just to remind our listeners, the goal of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization used to be, according to its first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, it was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Do you think that this conflict at least signifies the achievement of two of these goals? Have we seen the another like beat down of Germany and pushing them into another decades long evolution of rebuilding? Is this like the penultimate goal of NATO, honestly?
Well, no, I mean, I wouldn't put it quite that way. I mean, to keep the Germans down really meant at that point to keep them under the thumb of the United States, and that has been working for over 75 years. I mean, Germany is totally dominated. It's dominated by a whole lot of things. I mean, of course, I say it's militarily occupied. There are all these institutes of young leaders and things like that, where in fact the United States manages to select the leadership in German politics and media to a very large extent. And then there's the Marshall Plan, generous Marshall Plan, arranged things so that U.S. investment pretty much shapes the German economy, because right now, for instance, Germany is shifting to be a military to have a military industrial complex, but it happens to be that BlackRock and other Americans are heavily invested in that. So the profits from this German military-industrial complex will go to stockholders in BlackRock and so on. And so it certainly is keeping Germany down, and keeping the Russians out is the great purpose that was articulated by Brzezinski. The whole purpose of to keep American hegemony is to prevent cooperative world of cooperation and so on between Russia and Germany. And the original Cold War, in retrospect, it's come clear to me that the whole thing, when Churchill went and said an iron curtain has come down, of course it's always been British policy to keep Europe divided, and British policy was greatly influenced on American policy as the United States took over Britain's role as the great imperialist power. And Atchison is a personification of that. He's almost he looks British. And they took over the whole thing of keeping the Cold War. Russia was the Soviet Union was never going to invade Western Europe. That's ridiculous. They were suffering from a devastating war. They never had any such intentions, but we made it out that they were a huge threat, and that allowed them to rearm Germany as an adjunct of the United States, to keep Russians out of Europe, and to keep the Americans there. And the fact is that all of this has been working the whole time, and it's still working. And the state of Germany being down doesn't necessarily mean that. I know there's an idea that this is deliberately done to destroy the German economy. Well, I wouldn't put it quite that way. The U.S., by controlling investment, has already managed to control the German economy so that it isn't very competitive with the American economy. And that will just continue. But I don't think I don't think we're back to the Morgenthau plan. I don't know what you know about the Morgenthau plan, but that was a notion that was in the United States, the end of World War I, that we should industrialize Germany and turn it into pasture, which was a terrible idea because the population of Germany would have starved. But and that policy was turned around into its contrary, which was the Marshall Plan, which was to help German industry get back on its feet, but in ways that were not competitive with the United States.
You about a year ago, you wrote an article titled "The Specter of Germany is Rising," but I want to revisit that because now I just asked that question. I have to disagree, at least now, that the specter of Germany is still rising, and I think that we could make a good case for the specter of Poland to rise. So we know that the United States needs a buffer state between itself and Russia. It's absolutely necessary. They need it. That's just penultimate, and it kind of utilized Ukraine in that respect. But with Ukraine being basically decimated and rendered almost like useless in this sense, we've seen a massive rearmament of Poland. There's been a myriad of articles in 2023 about them buying tanks, jets, more armament, and I think in September it was announced that they would purchase 24 billion in weapons to increase their security. So what does this mean in the grand scheme of things? Is Ukraine no longer going to be the buffer state, or is Poland now going to be the United States military leader for the EU? What kind of messages can we pull from this?
I am not. By the way, funny thing is, I don't remember this article of mine, "The Spectre of Germany." I don't remember that. What did I mean? I don't get that. What is Spectre in what way?
It was from September 12th of 2022. And you talked about Germany revanchism, kind of what we've already touched on in here.
Yeah, that's this revanchism I'm talking about. But that's different from. That's not the same thing. Because it is planning to build itself up militarily, and the Poles too. So all of that, but they haven't done it yet, and it hasn't happened yet. And the idea is that they're using Ukraine. They're going to do that to arm Ukraine indefinitely. All of that, I really don't know how that's going to work out. Really that. But of course, the difficulty. This is one of the difficulties: is that the Germans and the Poles don't get along that well. Neither have the Ukrainians and the Poles. And so this great European alliance with our common values is sort of shaky somewhere, because in fact, to a large extent, the Poles hate almost all their neighbors except the Lithuanians. And I don't know where it can go, because actually Polish foreign policy is sort of famous for being overdone. I mean, they're now demanding reparations from Germany, although they took a big piece of Germany after World War II, and Germany doesn't feel it owes them much of anything. And I don't know where this will lead. It means that there's this very uncomfortable neighbors in and it's true that the German economy seems to be going down as the Poles are going up, but there's probably limits to that. I think they're also fairly intertwined, because there's German companies in Poland and Polish workers in Germany. They don't not like each other, but they have a certain dependence.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to perhaps turn to Kosovo, and what happened there. I must admit that I was very grateful to your book for setting out a number of things that you had to read between the lines, and other things, such as in Tim Judah's book about Kosovo, to get an idea of what was going on. So, could you give perhaps our readers a brief overview of some points that you think are the main misconceptions about the violence that surged up in Kosovo in 1997, and what the conclusion, such as it was at the end of the summer of 1999, was like?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know that it's the problem is, the Kosovo situation was a very uncomfortable one, and I knew some people, a few people. I think of Jan Oberg and his Peace Foundation, who was trying. And by the way, the wife of President Mitterrand. These are two people I knew who were sponsoring meetings between various Yugoslavs and Kosovars and Kosovo Albanians and Serbs, to try to work out solutions. And my impression, I attended some of those meetings, and there were certainly intellectuals who were influential, who were willing and able to work out some kinds of compromise. But this was systematically opposed by the United States and the West, you see. They didn't want a solution. And you've got to see this. You can say that the problem was difficult because there were historic problems and so on about Kosovo. But, and to go through all that is very complicated. But there were, like a lot of problems, if you have a bit of goodwill, you can solve them. But if you have nothing but determination to exploit that in order to cause trouble, well, that works even quicker. And that's really what happened. And you see, there were a lot of, you have these historic misunderstandings and problems and so on. But what happened is that I think it was really in the beginning of 1998, you had the Kosovo Liberation Army, so-called, go into action and start assassinating people in Kosovo. I think they went after the rector of Pristina University, and they were carrying out classic terrorist attacks. And initially, the State Department called that group terrorists. And you see, they were assassinating Serbs, but they were also assassinating Albanians who collaborated. That is to say, down to postmen, people who were accepting the present regime government. And of course, there was repression of that, and this repression was pretty effective. But the United States sent in this Kosovo, what do you call it? This this group of monitors, and somehow or other, this American William Walker got in charge of it, and this was supposed to be a peacemaking monitor group, but he used this incident that occurred in January 1999 in Rhetoric as an incident to start the war. That was a total false flag, if you will, not exactly a false flag, but it was an incident that they could jump on and misrepresent and use as a cause for war. By the way, it was this village of Rachak where there were people who were killed. Now, the fact is that I know the correspondent of Figaro. What is his name? He was a veteran and a conservative, and not particular, but he and the other correspondents knew that what was presented as a massacre of civilians was a planned and announced operation of the Serbian police. They announced it. They invited people to come. Police journalists to cover it. That they were retaliating against a village which was made up of these assassins who had been killing policemen, something that policemen tend to resent quite considerably. And it was a military operation against an identified base of this Uchaka group. And William Walker went in and put on a show for the media saying, "Oh, this is the most horrible thing I've ever seen." And he'd seen a lot because he had sponsored killing in Latin America, in Central America. And this was used as this was incredible false representation of events. But as usual, the Western media accepted whatever the Western authorities say. And then he withdrew the monitoring group. And if the monitoring group had stayed, you'd have known what was going on, but it wasn't there. So since he took it out, the press could then report every kind of imaginary genocide that somebody whispered in their ear. And so the whole bombing was arranged, and it was arranged, and you see why, because the moment it went on from March to June, and the moment that the Serbs allowed the Americans to go into Kosovo, what did they start doing? Building a huge military base for the United States. That's what they wanted to do all the time. The whole point was to get NATO in there so that the U.S. could build another military base, which is a huge military base. And now Kosovo is mainly sort of their main industry is this U.S. military base, and that's in a sense but that's one thing. Purpose of the war. The other purpose of the war, of course, was to give NATO its new mission. That's the main point. The main point was to save NATO from of obsolescence, because the Warsaw Pact had quit. There was no Soviet Union. There was no Soviet threat. Nothing. But you had to keep NATO going in order to keep the US in. Germany down and the Russians out. You had to keep NATO going. So, with the pretext of this false massacre, you suddenly had a threat of a genocide. So suddenly NATO has a new mission. It's no longer a defensive alliance. It's one that will save people from genocide, and that's how they saved. They used Kosovo to save NATO so it could go on for future wars. That's what it was all about, period.
I want to touch on while we're talking about Kosovo and Serbia, maybe bringing it closer to the right now. When the recent events happened in Armenia, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan, a lot of my Serbian friends were incredibly fearful, which I think Serbs a lot of times are just very fearful in general for good reason. But they said, they were like, if they did that to Artsakh, they're coming for Kosovo next. And they kind of did. We did see a little bit of escalatory actions in Kosovo recently. Kind of a mass confusion. I'm still not really certain what actually happened, but do you think that they're coming? Well, I guess they'll always be coming for Kosovo and Serbia, but how do these things become interrelated? Like, I think that the Serbs saw them being able to run through Artsakh so quickly as a direct threat, because Armenia is historically a Russian ally. So do you think that these escalatory actions in Kosovo will continue to increase as stuff happens around the globe?
Look, I don't go in for predictions, but you see, I think there's a big difference. I have heard. I don't know much about Armenia. I don't know anything about Armenia. I mean, I've been in Kosovo. I've been in Serbia. These are places that I've spent a lot of time. Armenia is terra incognita for me. However, I have heard that the president of Armenia, whose name I can't recall offhand,
Nikolai Pashinyan.
aspires to join the West. And so he let Karabakh go because he couldn't get in while there's a conflict there. But of course the problem is, if you look at the geography there, it's very complicated, because not only was there this piece of Armenian land, Nagorno-Karabakh, that was surrounded by Azerbaijan, but then there's a piece of Azerbaijan that's separated from Azerbaijan by Armenia, and so there's possibility of more war there. And this is age-old conflict, and I find it difficult to compare to anything. But of course, it is part of the geopolitical struggle going on in so much as Armenia has been traditionally uh, protected by Russia, you might say, and Russia apparently the current president was not very friendly with Russia and has sort of broken that off. A lot of people in Armenia are not happy about that. I can't tell because it's very complicated and I don't easily compare it. The Kosovo situation is different because Kosovo, I don't know. I mean, the the interest now of the West is to put pressure on Serbia. Kosovo doesn't matter very much. I mean, it's a U.S. military base, but other than that, they can keep Serbia on edge because by various little tweaks and measures here and there. But the idea is, of course, Serbia is a holdout in not being against Russia. But at least Serbia has the advantage now that its neighbor, Hungary, is not so keen on this Ukrainian adventure either. Well, that's lucky. So, I mean, Serbia is surrounded by hostile NATO countries, but at least Hungary gives no sign of wanting to make war against Serbia. And that's very important because there are Hungarians living in Serbia and vice versa. I mean, you know, if you wanted to stir up trouble between those two, there's possibilities there. But it's not working to trouble there. So I don't know because uh, uh, I don't think much Europeans care very much about Kosovo. Kosovo is a totally American. I mean, they've got statues of American presidents there. It's a totally American colony. It's not the Europeans. The Europeans have the problem of a whole lot of Kosovars and many of them involved in criminal activities coming into their countries. So I don't think that there's much love for Kosovo. Of course, there is love for Armenia in France or California because there are a lot of this big Armenian diaspora. Um, so the cases, I see huge differences between them. And I'm not too sure where a comparison goes, but I think I think that there's wanting to harass the Serbs and get this somehow or other get the Serbs onto the Europeans. Some Europeans want to extend. I mean, like Ursula von der Leyen, she wants to extend uh, Europe, the EU, even into Western Balkans. I think some countries don't want to do that. I think the French feel that there are too many in there already, and it's getting completely out of hand. But but I really don't know exactly who is doing what um, there in Kosovo. There's also the problem of Bosnia, which is being is run by European directors, etc. It has no independence whatsoever. There's potential problems there because Republika Srpska has good relations with Russia. I don't know. The situation is inherently unstable, and one can push it in this direction and there the other, but maybe the local people aren't really ready to fight.
Mm. And I think for as I close out, where do you see the current trajectory of NATO? What comes next for the alliance?
I make a point of not making predictions.
No predictions.
I try very hard to understand the past and the present, and the future is always full of surprises. I don't know. They seem to have, the problem is they seem to have no plan B. They seem to be launched into this. If you hear Annalena Baerbock, um, it's interesting, by the way. I think she took down. I think she took down the portrait of Bismarck from the foreign ministry. Uh, it's a symbolic of this little girl who takes down the symbol of geopolitical wisdom, removes it from the foreign office of Germany. Um, let's just be straight out simple minded, and that's what it is. And they're going to stay with Ukraine until the victory, etc. Well, when they don't get that victory, what are they going to do? I don't know. I mean, they act like they're going to go on and defeat Russia, but there seem to be doubts about this in the United States. And right now, the doubts in the United States seem to be a bit more promising than in Europe. I think there are plenty of doubts in France, but Macron is going along with it. There's just a lack of intelligent leadership, a lack of wisdom in the political class that is stunning.
Well, I think on that very, very cheery note, we can perhaps close out this episode. Ms. Johnston, where can our listeners find you if they want to hear more from you?
Well, it's difficult because I could mention my age, which is quite advanced, more so than it says in Wikipedia, by the way. And they've got it 3 years wrong. And I don't have the energy to do very much in the way of writing. I would like to, of course, but I don't have the energy. So if I have anything to say in writing, and Consortium News is where I would want to be, because I have great respect for the work that Joe Lauria is doing with that publication. I think it's very important, and honest. I would like to contribute, but I have limits.
We certainly understand, but we're very happy that
There's
you were
my
able to contribute some of that to our discussion, because I think we enjoyed this, and I know our listeners will benefit greatly from it.
well, there's my memoirs. The book of my memoirs is something, because I also speak about Yugoslavia in that.
Did you and the title of your memoirs, Diana, for our listeners?
Circle in the Darkness.
Thank you so much.
Circle in the Darkness, and it's a Clarity Press. Circle in the Darkness, and that's my memoirs. And I also speak there somewhat about Yugoslavia, and that's my most recent. I would say my last book, the last one I had the energy to do. Right.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you once again to our listeners for joining us for another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. Until next time.